of utilities and infrastructure projects. These projects are the backbone of our communities and economies, shaping the way in which we live and work, and effective management is essential when we undertake ambitious efforts to build and maintain vital infrastructure. In this presentation today, we'll explore the risks associated with managing utilities, the strategies to mitigate them, and discuss some of the latest technologies that can enhance project efficiency and effectiveness. So by the end of this presentation, you should have a comprehensive understanding of the challenges and best practices in managing utilities within an infrastructure project. In any utility infrastructure project, collaboration amongst various stakeholders is critical for success, and each stakeholder plays a vital role to achieve the success. So this includes effective collaboration and clear communication amongst the local authorities, the design team, the contractors, and the utility companies. And this is to ensure delivery of a safe, efficient, and high-quality project. Now, for the local authorities, it's essential to have regulatory oversight, ensuring compliance with local regulations and standards. And this can be achieved by conducting inspections to ensure project adherence to safety and quality. And it's also the local authorities' job to manage public engagement, communicating with the community to address any local concerns. For the design team, their key role is to develop detailed project plans and technical specifications, and it's also essential that they lead the site-wide coordination works by working closely with the other stakeholders to ensure design feasibility and address any design-related issues that may arise during construction. We also have the contractor, whose responsibilities will be to manage the day-to-day construction activities, and they'll also be responsible for site quality control, ensuring that the construction meets the design specifications and quality standards, whilst also complying with safety protocols to protect their own workforce and the public. Finally, we have the utility companies. Now, their main responsibility is to ensure continuous utility services throughout the project, and this can be achieved by ensuring their assets integrate with the new infrastructure. Now, they can do this by utilising their technical expertise and design alterations to their networks under the New Roads and Streetworks Act diversions process. Now, under this process, utility diversions are split into what's known as C stages, and these stages run from C2 to C9. However, the main focus of this presentation is going to be looking mostly at the C2 to C4 process, with C2 being initial inquiries and obtaining records, C3 which is budget estimates for diversions and utility works, and then finally C4, which is detailed designs, including timescales and costs. Now, once a utility company has completed a design, they'll normally dictate whether their designs are categorised as contestable or non-contestable, and it's critical to understand the distinction between the both for effective project planning and execution. Now, for contestable works, these are tasks to be carried out by third-party contractors, and can be appointed by the client or the contractor directly. An example of this may be an installation of a new utility connection, such as water or low voltage, or even laying new telecoms ducts. Now, there are some benefits to contestable works, which include competitive pricing, flexibility in choosing a contractor, and potentially faster project completion. However, it is worth noting that contestable works still require project adherence to utility company standards, and often involve inspections to ensure compliance. Now, in contrast, there are non-contestable utility works as well, and these must be performed by the utility company or their approved contractors directly. An example of this may be works on existing infrastructure, such as maintenance or upgrades, or even emergency repairs of their network. And these are typically on high-risk assets, such as high-voltage electric or high-pressure gas mains. Now, the reason works may be non-contestable could just be purely for safety, reliability, and integrity of the utility network. Typically, these works involve direct coordination with the utility company who manage and oversee the works. However, due to the management processes, it may mean misalignment with the project programs and coordination with other site works. A utility infrastructure project involves several key stages to ensure a successful completion. And these stages include planning, preparation, procurement, and implementation. For the planning stage, the aim is to identify project objectives and requirements, evaluate any technical, financial, and environmental feasibilities, and develop a detailed project plan outlining the scope, timeline, and budget. Under the preparation stage is to create detailed designs and technical specifications, obtaining the necessary permits and approvals from local authorities, and also conducting site surveys and assessments to find any potential challenges or site constraints. Under the procurement, this stage looks to issue for tenders for contractors and suppliers and evaluate those bids based on criteria such as cost, experience, and capability. And then finally, we have implementation, which is the execution of construction activities according to project plan, monitor those construction quality to ensure compliance and specification. I'll now hand over to Martin, who's going to delve into these stages in a little bit more detail over the next few slides, highlighting the risks associated with utilities at each stage and how to mitigate those risks throughout the project.
Thank you very much, Darryl, and good morning, everyone. As Darryl says, I'm going to take you through each of those stages in a little bit more detail, drawing on my experience from the past 20 odd years or so of working on major infrastructure projects in the UK and dealing with utilities on those. So initially starting off with the planning stage, the first element is making sure that you know exactly what you're doing and that your scope is very, very clearly defined. First step of that is to identify all of the existing utilities that are affected by the works. I'll move on shortly to go about the best way doing that, again, drawing on previous experience. And then you need to determine any works that are required to these utilities, be that diversions or new connections, and also temporary and permanent works that are required. Some temporary works, for instance, for during the construction stage for site compounds or whatever, and also permanent connection works as well for any new facilities in the area. There is a significant amount of risk around all utility works. As I said, determining what utilities you've got in the area is critical to this, but there is always a risk that you won't. Records are not particularly good. They're not always kept up to date, so you will likely encounter unforeseen problems. Also, unforeseen ground conditions as well, which could affect the utility installations, such as soil quality, environmental issues, contamination, poor slope stability, high groundwater levels. You can undertake site investigation to mitigate these, but then that will give you a level of information, but you cannot do that across the whole of the site. That's just not realistic. Talk there about legal issues as well in terms of land ownership. It's very crucial to understand who owns the land that you're going to be working in. When you're working in a highway, that's normally fairly well defined, but when you go into private land, that carries a greater level of risk, and that's something that you need to address early on in the project as possible. Failure then to consider utility outage requirements. So that's any downtime that's required on the network for you to undertake the works. This can provide a significant constraint on program. When you're working on major lines such as high pressure gas mains, high voltage electric, you can only get downtime on those in the summer. It depends on the wider network as well and when you can do these. So that can provide, if you've got a number of high pressure gas mains, for instance, that are affected, that can have a significant program effect. And then also environmental constraints as well. So what do you have things like ancient woodland, etc., that will impact on your works, both in terms of the line, say the electric line itself, and also for construction requirements. So where do you need a construction compound? How are you going to access the works? What environmental mitigation is required to enable you to undertake the works safely and without detriment to the local environment? So in terms of how this can be de-risked, as I say, ensuring that all the utility information is available. Next slide goes into that in a little bit more detail. Then once you do receive this information, you need to review it. You need to make sure that it all makes sense. It all ties together. You're clear on what the records that you received are showing you, and that to verify that information, and as it says there, identifying any inconsistencies, and also making sure that the data is kept up to date as well. If you've got a major project that's running through a number of years, then utility data is technically only valid for 3 months, and you need to ensure that any changes to the network during the lifespan of the project are captured and mitigated accordingly. Next, talk about creating a utility asset register. So this is effectively a list of every affected utility within the working area. We're working on how we can create these registered automatically, so automating them. But that's basically a register of what the asset is, who owns it, is it overhead, is it underground, what size is it, what voltage is it, what pressure is it, etc. And that basically provides your base for the work that you'll be doing. Then once you've identified what information you've got and what utility companies are affected, you need to start engaging with them. Getting engagement with them so they understand what you're doing is critical. So recommending early meetings with affected utility companies to go through your scope and program so that they can understand what they need to do to provide you with provide us with what we need in terms of design and information, etc. Utility companies are often under-resourced, so as soon as they understand what we need, then the better, really. Identification of any works that are critical to the overall project program. I talked earlier about outages. This is so yeah, that's likely to be the major constraint. Also, if you've got several non-contestable works as well, utility companies will often require them to be done by their contractors. It's often very specialist work, so they may only have one or two contractors that can do those works. So that needs to get programmed in and considered as early as possible. Maintaining their record of all contact with utility companies. So a simple register, simply when you spoke to them, what you spoke to them about, keeping minutes of all meetings, making sure everything is recorded. So both parties are happy with what's been agreed, recording of any actions and then tracking of those going forward. Ensuring any contractual requirements with the utility companies are identified as soon as possible. So Daryl talked about the C process earlier through NERSRA. Again, that's specific to highway works and it's what utility companies are familiar with. However, if you're doing works that require something that sits outside of the NERSRA process, then you need to get that bottomed out with the utility companies as soon as possible, because the way the NERSRA mechanism is for it and for payment, if you're asking for something that's not covered by that, so for instance, to draw an example for if you're doing, say, a DCO project where you need to identify land take, both temporary and permanent, then that's not covered by the NERSRA process. So you need to agree this with the utility company and how they're going to provide you with what you want as soon as possible. Undertaking ground investigation surveys. There are different levels of survey that you will undertake across the route, and it's not realistic to undertake boreholes every 10 meters. So it'll be targeted in certain areas where there's normally a lot of utilities or there is a significantly higher risk. But the sooner you get that information from those surveys, the sooner that can start informing the design. Then having an overall utility manager to manage utilities on the scheme. So that person will be a coordinator and a good communicator, bringing together all of the project design team and of the utility companies. So having somebody with sufficient experience in that is critical. Reviewing the scope of the work at the outset and making sure that everybody's on the same page, everyone knows what everyone's doing, and that the scope is fully defined, and that the utility companies, as I say, are aware of what we need from them and when we need that, at what stage in the project. Next slide, please, Daryl. So apologies, I appear to put myself on mute there. Yeah, so how we go about obtaining existing utility information, very important to understand what we've got. Going back to what I was saying before, understanding what's critical, which utility companies are affected by. If you don't get this search right, then that can cause huge problems further down the line. If you do encounter unknown services, then this causes significant issues. So the best way we've kind of learned over the past few years to do this is to engage a specialist utility search company. There are a number of companies out there that will undertake desktop surveys for you. Obviously, you have to pay for these, but it's much more cost effective to get a third party company to do this. They have it's what they do ultimately, and they often have access to the utility company records, so they can get straight into the data and then provide that directly to you. They also have an obligatory response time of 20 working days under NERSRA, so this can help you to plan from a program perspective the overall project and when you will receive the data. These utility search companies also can provide CAD models as well, in line with our required specifications. So what we've done on previous projects is give them the CAD standard for the project, and they've produced the models in line with that. So that's meant that we've got utility models that are ready to go and can be integrated into the wider engineering and environmental design. Also setting up, making sure everything's set up correctly to manage the data. So we've used share file sites that the utility search company upload the information to, and then we can take that from there and review that. And that can be updated and refreshed through the project as required. Should the scope change, should additional searches, say in extra areas, be required. Certainly, as I say, using the third party search companies has proved to be a significant advantage going forward. There's also there talk about how we use GIS from those CAD models. You'll get the raw CAD models, but we've started on a lot of projects using GIS more and more to allow the design to be integrated and to have an overall GIS model of the environmental and engineering design. And by having GIS models, you can demonstrate how the utility designs impact on the overall project. And also you can model these against time as well in the fourth dimension with the use of a GIS model. So getting that sort of thing set up at the start of the project is critical to success and to delivery. Next slide, please, Daryl. For some reason I keep going on to mute. So yeah, utility design and preparation and why this is important. So getting the utility design correct is very important in project delivery. So mapping out, as I've talked about, existing utilities against the proposed scheme allows you to identify which utility assets are impacted by the proposals. So this then allows you to provide a safe design and minimize disruption to the overall networks. Also allows you to discuss the design requirements with the utility companies. Getting them on side and cooperating is very important to the delivery of the project. Requirement also to distinguish between contestable and non-contestable assets. As Daryl mentioned previously, the utility companies will take a lot more responsibility for non-contestable assets. They will be the ones that are critical to your project delivery and carry the most risk. So establishing which are non-contestables and focusing on those will allow for successful delivery. Also spoke earlier about the land ownership requirements and where we need easements and way leaves to allow both access in the temporary case to undertake construction and also allow future permanent access for the utility companies to undertake maintenance to their assets. Getting that sort of thing agreed early on is critical for delivery. There's often legal agreements to be drawn up. They can take time. That can potentially delay the project. So in terms of what the risks are, utilities can be very, very complex. You can have certain areas where there are a lot of utilities, certain amount of unknown utilities. One thing I haven't spoke about is private utilities. So far I've focused on public utilities, which you can obtain records for. There will also in rural areas be private utilities that are owned by the landowner. So you will need to engage with a landowner. They may not have records of those, but they will be able to provide information. So engaging with landowners as well is critical. Any utility designs that you put forward will impact on the local environment. It's both underground and overground. Also need to consider the temporary case during construction. What will the impact be during construction in terms of traffic, in terms of temporary facilities that are required during these works? What are the environmental impacts? How can these be mitigated against? All of this forms part of the design. It's not just a case of designing a new pipe from A to B. Where you have above ground utilities, such as overhead electric, how can these be designed so that the visual impact is limited? You'll have seen recently some of the new pylons that are being put up in the southwest of the UK. Certainly, they reduce the overall visual impact of these lines, and I think you'll see more and more of those going forward. So, how can we de-risk some of these issues? most of this is about engagement with the utility companies, making sure they've got the latest design of the overall project, making sure that they're working with the latest information, making sure you talk to them, have regular meetings with them. If there are certain areas where you've got a lot of different utility companies affected, have workshops, for instance, on those areas with all of the utility companies in the room together to get everybody talking to each other, to identify what the risks are, to allow you to mitigate those. Engagement is the key in all of this. Also mentioned there, it's often worth engaging with a contractor during this design process so they can understand some of the constructability issues. So anything that may provide a risk further down the line can be mitigated as soon as possible. It's all about this. It's all about getting everybody talking, getting everybody coordinated. I talked about the role of the utility manager earlier on. They're critical to all of this. Next slide, please, Daryl. So next stage is procurement. So this is engaging with owners of assets within the site boundary. So we talked before about how they're identifying them, having initial meetings with them to get them on board. But now, as the project moves on, you'll start delving more into the detail and what we need from them to enable successful delivery. So we need to start talking to them about some of the legal aspects I talked about earlier in terms of way leaves and easements, making sure that they're familiar with the project and what we require. So as I mentioned earlier, if it's outside of the regular NERSWA process, how they can provide us with what we need, and also get them to understand any constraints from the project, any certain milestones in terms of projects, milestones in terms of the project when we need certain items by. You don't just want them delivering everything at the end. There has to be constant engagement as you go along. You don't want to give them a design for the route and then come back a year later, they've done a load of design work, which doesn't really meet our requirements. It's about having those constant discussions going on, making sure they understand the project requirements mentioned there in terms of the risk. Pardon me. Also worth noting confidentiality. I have worked on projects where they are confidential and non-disclosure agreements have been required. This is just something to be aware of in terms of the project. If an NDA is required with the utility company, you need to get that set up as soon as possible. The same goes as well for a utility search company. If you are do engage one of those, you may well need an NDA with them. So just make sure everything like that is in place to get everybody on board as soon as possible, to ensure that you kind of hit the ground running and that all your processes in place and everybody knows what they're doing. It's about talking to each other, as I say, regular meetings, regular check-ins to make sure everybody is on the same page and everyone's working together. Next slide, please, Daryl. So again, talking again about how we procure the utility company. So making sure that they're on board and they can provide us with what we need and the best quality. Making sure also that this is in line with their own specifications. Utility companies are very tightly regulated by the various regulators, so they need to ensure what they're doing is in line with their required processes, and that can take time as well. So making sure everything is just all comes together under that umbrella is very useful. Also, there's sometimes a misunderstanding of utility companies of what's required in terms of our design. They will come back with designs that maybe aren't integrated into the wider scheme design. So it's making sure there's time in the project to review their designs when they're received and make sure it's integrated into the wider design. Also to challenge it as well. Utility companies can look to, if this is being funded by a third party, then they can maybe use that as an opportunity to get enhancement to their network if somebody else is paying for it. So we need to be prepared to challenge what the utility company are coming back with and just understand why some of their designs are as they are. There is usually a very valid reason as to why the design is as it is, but that's not always obvious from looking at a line on a plan. So make time towards the end of your project to review anything received from the utility company and discuss it with them and challenge it where necessary. Talk also there about client against contractor procurement. So there are two ways of doing this, that the client can procure the utility company directly, or it can be done through the contractor. By the client doing it, you have a lot more control over what you're doing, over the assurance, and can avoid some additional costs that the contractor may look to put on. However, the contractor often has experience of doing this sort of thing, and will have relationships with both the utility companies and with suppliers for materials, etc. So they may be able to do it a little bit quicker, but maybe you don't have that element of control. So there is a pros and cons to that, and I don't think there's a right answer on that front. It is different for each project. Next slide, please, Darryl. Next part is how we kind of go about managing scope change. So it's likely on a large infrastructure project that the design of the project itself will change during the lifespan of the project. So the first thing is establish a baseline at the start of the project. So you have a baseline that everybody's working on, and knows where that stands, so that any change can be measured against that. So what we've done in the past is using the utility asset register, and then doing a RAG, red, amber, green analysis on each of the assets when there is a change to the design, to demonstrate to a utility company where there are changes and how that will impact on each of their assets. There is a risk as well if you go to a utility company, we found this on other projects, and say, oh, there've been some changes to the project. They panic and think that everything that they've done to date is now completely out of date. They throw in an early warning notice and a huge bill, and it sets the hairs running a little bit. So how you manage the communication of any change is also critical. And it's about getting confidence of the utility company that you're working with them. You don't want to be working against them, because you are dependent on them. So having regular discussions with them can allow each of these any change to be managed accordingly. It's all about communication at the end of the day. That's what it's all about, establishing those relationships as early as you can and making sure that they're maintained. Next slide, please, Darryl. And just a final sort of bit of conclusion as to what I've just talked about. I've been through a lot there in the last 20 minutes, and thank you very much for listening. But early engagement, as I mentioned, is absolutely critical. Making sure that the utility company are on board, that they know what you want, they know when you want it, and also on the flip side, they know when they're going to get information from you. And setting up regular meetings, getting them on side, making sure that they're familiar with what's required is absolutely the way to go. Establishing those relationships at an early stage in the project is the key to success. Making sure that you obtain all the existing utility information, making sure it's mapped out, making sure the whole of the design team can access this information. I spoke earlier about GIS and how that can be used to understand where utility assets are impacted. You can use that GIS to tag data on the asset in it, and also the creation of the utility asset register, both live documents that can be constantly updated throughout the project to ensure that everybody knows where the utility design is up to and how this is integrated into the wider engineering and environmental design. Making sure that utility companies have got adequate resource to deal with any changes, etc., and also making sure that you've got adequate resource within your utility teams to ensure that project deadlines can be met, and that you have sufficient time to review a design and get the very, very best design, best for all parties, into the project. Early engagement with a contractor, as I mentioned, to understand some of the constructability issues. Contractor with experience of this sort of thing will be able to identify any hazards, any risks. Getting them involved early on allows those risks to be mitigated and appropriate measures put in place, something that's very, very important. Design workshops, as I've spoken about, making sure that everybody's talking to each other, making sure that, as I say, they can be targeted for certain areas. If you've got an area that's got a high concentration of utilities or a high concentration of non-contestable utilities, then drill down and focus on these and make sure everybody's on the same page and that everything is integrated. And make sure that your scope's clearly defined at the start of the project. Make sure everything is baselined, communicated to all internal and external team members. This allows any change, any scope creep to be managed accordingly, and will allow that process to be managed well, managed appropriately, and hopefully lead to a successful delivery of the project. Thank you very much.